Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to Film Studies. We jump right into Universal Studios with the film that saved them. 1931 was a very rough year for Universal Studios. We are right smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression. And even though Hollywood has remained relatively better off than most other industry in America during the Great Depression, simply because people enjoy having that escape for a couple hours when they go to a movie and get to sit in a nice movie palace and watch a movie and kind of forget about the fact that they've been laid off or just need an escape. Not all the studios are doing as well as some of the others. MGM, they're okay. Warner Brothers doing all right. RKO, doing okay. But studios like Fox and like Universal were really sort of hurting. Paramount was doing all right. And they needed a hit. And we're going to talk later on what Fox does to get themselves out of the economic doldrums. But Universal was sort of struggling to find an identity. So earlier on in this class, we talked about Nosferatu. And we said that Nosferatu was a German film made during the Weimar Republic period. It's an expressionist movie that was made by Prana Studios in Germany, and Max Schreck was Nosferatu. But it was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. And when his wife, Stoker's wife, found out, who was still alive, his widow found out that Prana Studios had made this film and just simply changed some of the names around, she sued the studio, won, and they had to declare bankruptcy and go out of existence, essentially. That's been well documented in here. However, by 1931, Stoker's widow had passed away. And so Universal literally is going to bet everything. It's like going to Vegas and putting your last $100 bill on the roulette table and putting it on red and just having them spin the wheel and hoping something good comes up. Because they essentially decide to bet the studio on Stoker's novel, acquiring the rights to Stoker's novel. And so they are going to make the film that will save the studio. And this film, coupled with Frankenstein, will indeed establish Universal as the horror studio and save Universal from bankruptcy during the Great Depression. So Dracula is a 1931 United States horror film directed by Todd Browning and starring Bela Lugosi as the title character. The film was produced by Universal Pictures Company Incorporated and is based on the stage play of the same name by Hamilton Dean and John Balderston, which in turn is based on the novel Dracula by the great Bram Stoker. So there we have A Nightmare of Horror, Dracula. This is actually going to be a re-release poster that I thought that you all would enjoy seeing. Bram Stoker's novel had already been filmed without permission as Nosferatu in 1922, as I said, by expressionist German filmmaker F.W. Murnau. Enthusiastic young Hollywood producer Carl Laemmle Jr. also saw the box office potential in Stoker's gothic chiller. Unlike the German counterpart, this one would be a fully authorized version, since F.W. Murnau films, his film had fallen under the wrath of Stoker's widow, who had tried to destroy all prints of Nosferatu. He intended that it would be a spectacle to rival the lavish Hunchback of Notre Dame and the Phantom of the Opera. Like those films, Carl Laemmle insisted that it must star the man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney, arguably the greatest silent horror star of all time. Despite Chaney being under contract at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Todd Browning gets brought over and approached to direct this new Universal epic. He had been at MGM too. Todd Browning, incidentally, had already directed Lon Chaney as a vampire in the lost 1927 silent movie London After Midnight. Just a side note here, Lon Chaney has more lost films than any other major Hollywood star in history. Perhaps London After Midnight is the most famous lost film of them all. However, a number of factors would limit Carl Laemmle's plans. First, Lon Chaney himself, who had been diagnosed with throat cancer in 1928, had already passed away from his terminal illness, so he was unable, of course, to play the Count. Furthermore, studio financial difficulties, coupled with the onset of the Great Depression, caused a drastic reduction in budget, forcing Laemmle to look at cheaper alternatives, which meant that several grand scenes that closely followed Stoker's storyline had to be abandoned and cut out of Universal's film altogether. Already a huge hit on Broadway, the tried and tested Dean Balderston Dracula play would become the blueprint as the production gained momentum. However, the question of who should play the Count remained. This would fall to the then current Broadway Dracula, Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi, but not without controversy. Originally, Carl Laemmle stated that he was not at all interested in Lugosi playing Dracula, in spite of the warm reviews Lugosi's stage portrayal had received, and instead sought to hire other actors. Against the tide of studio opinion, Lugosi lobbied hard and ultimately won the executives over, thanks in part to him accepting a salary far less than that of his co-stars, so Lugosi actually agreed to take less money. The eerie speech pattern of Lugosi's Dracula was said to have resulted from the fact that Lugosi didn't speak English, and therefore had to learn and speak his lines phonetically. This is a bit of an urban legend, and while it's true that Bela Lugosi didn't speak English at the time of his first English language play in 1919, and had learned his lines to that play phonetically, by the time of Dracula, Lugosi spoke English as well as he ever would. Lugosi's speech pattern would be imitated countless times by other Dracula portrayals, most often in an exaggerated or comedic way. So, if you've ever seen a Count Chocula commercial where, it's a very exaggerated version of Bela Lugosi, almost comedic version of Bela Lugosi, that's a testament to just how influential he was as the Count. So here are a couple studio publicity photos for Dracula. And, I don't know about you, but once you have seen Bela Lugosi as the Count, there is no other Count Dracula. Christopher Lee did all right later on, and of course, Max Schreck as Count Orlok was pretty chilling, but that's an entirely different type of vampire. Bela Lugosi is sort of the playboy, like good-looking Hungarian guy with the accent that just characterizes the role. And my goodness, was he spectacular in this movie. Here are a couple other publicity photos for the film. And it's that icy stare that's going to give this film such a cold feeling. Now, there is no soundtrack for this movie. The only music we hear is at the very beginning of the film as it's coming on. And Todd Browning wanted the film to have that cold, lifeless, silent, eerie feel to it that really just is perfect for the tone of this particular movie. Now, here we have some of Dracula's wives at the beginning of the film as they emerge from their coffins. When the film finally premiered on Valentine's Day, 1931, newspapers reported that members of the audience fainted in shock at the horror they were seeing on the screen. This publicity, which was shrewdly orchestrated by the film studio, helped to ensure that people would come to see the movie, if for no other reason than just straight up morbid curiosity. Dracula was a big gamble for a major Hollywood studio to undertake. In spite of the literary credentials of the source material, it was uncertain if an American audience was prepared for a full-length supernatural chiller. Though America had been exposed to other chillers before, like The Cat and the Canary, this was a straight-up horror movie with no comedic relief or trick ending that tried to downplay the supernatural. Guys, there had never been a purely horror film ever made before in America, at least a full-length one. And all other quote-unquote horror films had ended with some sort of an ending that was like, oh, it was all a magic trick, or oh, it was all a joke, or it was like a Scooby-Doo type ending where they pulled the mask off somebody or something. No, Dracula was a big gamble, and Universal wasn't exactly sure would American audiences pay to be just straight up scared by a horror movie, and one that had no trick ending or Scooby-Doo unmasking. Nervous executives breathed a massive collective sigh of relief when Dracula proved to be a huge box office sensation. And later that year, Universal would acquire the rights to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to even greater acclaim. Universal in particular would become the forefront of early horror cinema with a canon of films including The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Wolf Man, etc., etc. They are going to become the monster studio. And even to this day, Universal, when they need to make some money, know they can always play the monster card. To many film lovers and critics alike, Lugosi's portrayal is widely regarded as the definitive Dracula. I am included in that belief that he's the best. Lugosi had a powerful presence and authority on screen. The slow, deliberate pacing of his performance and lines like, "I bid you welcome," and "I never drink wine," gave his Dracula the air of a walking, talking corpse, albeit a charming one and a handsome one. Now, very different than Max Schreck as Count Orlok. And it was this portrayal which terrified 1930s movie audiences. He was just as compelling with no dialogue, and the many close-ups of Lugosi's face in icy silence would jump off the screen. With this mesmerizing performance, Dracula became Lugosi's signature role. His Dracula a cultural icon, and he himself a legend in the classic Universal horror film series. However, Dracula would ultimately become a role which would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. Despite his earlier stage successes in a variety of roles, from the moment Lugosi donned the cape on screen, it would forever see him typecast as the Count. And guys, this is what happens when you're too good at something. It would be very difficult for people to associate Bela Lugosi as anything but Count Dracula. And he was a great actor. He was in the silent version of Last of the Mohicans and was a brilliant actor who took his role very seriously and acting very seriously. But it would be difficult for Bela Lugosi to be like a Western star or something. People will be like, oh, look, Dracula's riding a horse. So, this is just not going to be something that he's going to be able to get away from. But he would embrace it. He loved being the Count and would dress up, wear the cape, and walk around town dressed up like Dracula. Later on in life, calls from Universal to act would be few and far between, so he would be relegated to opening like drive-in movie theaters and things like that. But my goodness, he he certainly embraced the role. So there is the cover of the DVD collection, Bela Lugosi's Universal Legacy Monster Collection, and he would appear in several other films for Universal. Believe it or not, he's going to be offered the role of Frankenstein and will turn it down. He was so famous after his Valentine's Day performance of, that's when the movie came out, on Valentine's Day, 1931. He got kind of a little bit too big for his britches and did not like the fact that Frankenstein's monster had no dialogue, no lines, and he would have to look ugly to be Frankenstein's monster. He didn't like those, so turned the roles down. And what a mistake that would be for Bela Lugosi. But to this day, we remember him best as Dracula.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to TCM. I'm Ben Mankiewicz. As we welcome in October, I ask you this question. Who's the bat who won't bleed out when there's a stranger all about? Drac. Bite on. Who's the bat who would bite the neck of another man? Drac. This bat is a bad mother sucker. Thanks to Monica Elliott for helping write that introductory homage. Dracula is our monster of the month, part of our annual Halloween celebration on TCM. Ranked number 33 on the American Film Institute's list of the greatest movie villains. Dracula has been a big screen bad guy for decades. And up next, the hit that continued Universal Pictures on its path to horror movie supremacy. The movie that has influenced all the vampire movies that came after it. Its impact can largely be traced to the performance of its star, Bela Lugosi. 1931, Dracula. The image that movie fans have of Dracula is inextricably linked to Bela Lugosi's performance in this picture. Lugosi became so enthralled with his character that he dressed and behaved like Dracula long after he stopped playing it. Lugosi is even buried in his Dracula costume. Lugosi originated the part on Broadway, playing the role from 1927 to 1930 in the play of the same name by Hamilton Dean and John Balderston. The play was only loosely based on Bram Stoker's novel. To economize on production design choices, execs at Universal decided to base the movie on the play. So we meet Count Dracula at his dilapidated castle in Transylvania, where he's well-mannered and dapper in his trademark tuxedo and slick-back hair. But for all his polished airs, Count Dracula radiates creepiness, especially when he tells his guest, Renfield, that he never drinks wine. The film's atmosphere brilliantly matches Dracula's dark deeds, thanks to director Todd Browning and cinematographer Carl Freund. From 1931, also starring Helen Chandler, David Manners, Dwight Fry, and Edward Van Sloan as vampire expert Van Helsing. Here's where Legend was supposed to play Count Dracula, Lon Chaney. Chaney had already worked with director Todd Browning on several films, but Chaney was also appealing because, unlike Lugosi, who was still making a name for himself in Hollywood, Chaney was an established star, man of a thousand faces. He'd had big hits, including The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, Phantom of the Opera in 25, London After Midnight in 27, as well as critical favorites like The Unknown with Joan Crawford, also from 1927. Chaney didn't play the lead in Dracula because he died shortly before the production started. Though Universal did consider other actors, such as Paul Muni, the studio went with Lugosi because he'd played the part repeatedly on Broadway. Although Chaney never played Dracula, his son, Lon Chaney Jr., played the Count in the second sequel to Universal's 1931 classic. We'll be showing that film later tonight. But up next, we have the first sequel about a countess who inherited her blood-sucking inclination from her dad.